Thanks for listening to Curious Cat, the podcast that examines the shadowy space where science and the supernatural collide. I'm your host, Jennifer Holtz. Join me every week as I explore what it means to be a soul in a meat suit. Welcome to Curious Cat. A couple months back, while I was researching strange history in and around the Orlando area, I found a YouTube video that stuck with me. A young man, Trevor, likes to explore abandoned places, and he went to a house in an upscale neighborhood of Orlando to see what had happened to this overgrown house, whose owners were gone. The wife had been murdered, and her husband sat in prison for life. Something about his camera falling on the dog crates in the driveway and the gutted interior, it's haunted me ever since. It's a story straight off of 48 Hours or 2020, and I feel the need to share it here. And I still have questions. Let's get into it. In March 2013, David and Shanti met. David Tronnes and Shanti Cooper. They met on Match.com. She was a successful businesswoman from Orlando. She had her own business. David had just inherited a large sum of money from his father. They hit it off, and the couple started traveling back and forth between Minnesota and Florida. And they finally realized after David had retired from 3M, he needed to move to Florida. Soon after arriving in Orlando, David purchased a large house in Orlando's Delaney Park neighborhood, intent on renovating it. The house ended up being a bigger project than David initially thought. In fact, he got so over his head with it that he called the Zombie House show on A&E. When they arrived to see what was left of the house, they said, yes, this is one of the worst that we've seen. It's a shoebox. There's nothing holding up this house but 2 inches of stucco. When producers of the Zombie House show arrived to have an early briefing with the couple and, just make sure they were fully on board with the shooting of their show, pretty quickly they saw that there was tension between David and Shanti stayed for the bare minimum of the meeting and then left. April 24th, 2018. Police receive a disturbing call from David. Barely coherent, he can't even get their address out. He says on the 911 call that his wife Shanti isn't breathing. When paramedics arrive, they find her unresponsive. She's not in the bathtub, like David had said. She's beside the bed. They pronounce her dead. Because she was pronounced dead, investigators soon arrived on the site. 2 investigators. And they will be integral to Shanti finding justice, if there is such a thing in such a case. 3 months would go by until David was arrested for the murder of Shanti Cooper. More details were starting to emerge. David purchased the house through a trust his mother set up, and David never listed Shanti on the property deed. The house, as seen on Zillow and other sites, which I've linked to in the show notes, was purchased for a little over $600,000, and it was nice inside. There were great hardwood floors. It maybe needed some topical updating, right? A new kitchen island, maybe some new light fixtures. And apparently upstairs, the rooms were in a configuration that wasn't modern. Smaller sized rooms that weren't connected directly to a bathroom. But David went further than just a topical renovation. He gutted the place. I'm talking ripped out every shred of the flooring, every shred of the lighting, of the electrical stuff, of the plumbing, of the sewer stuff. He ripped out the drywall. It was down to the studs. So when that zombie house director came to take a look at it and he said it was a shoebox, it really was just a few boards and 2 inches of stucco holding that house up. Pretty quickly, zombie house crew came in and they fortified it enough to keep it intact until they could shoot the full episode of Zombie House and get to work. David had gotten upside down with the place. It had become part of his persona. I'm the guy doing the renovation, but it had become too much. It had to have brought so much tension to their early days of marriage. In fact, they began to sleep in separate parts of the house. With Shanti and her son when he would come visit in the apartment above the garage, and David in the garage below with the dogs. It's said that the fight that preceded the murder was about David going to a men's-only club in Orlando, and maybe Shanti had found receipts. I didn't know what a men's-only club was before I started doing research of this episode. But just know for now, he'd gone many times before and during their marriage. At the time of adventuring with Trevor's video that I've got links to in the show notes, there were over $130,000 worth of liens on the property. As he's going around the site, it's chilling because you're seeing leaflets, pink leaflets left by the city of Orlando for infractions, things that were against the law, that, violated the law in that area. And some of them, they were just stacked up like a bunch of old newspapers in places. They were just tagged to the front door and other places, just littering the property. The other thing I noticed that creeped me out was these gargoyles that were concrete gargoyles with this black mold on them around the eaves of the roof that I found very haunting. But the saddest bit, besides the empty dog kennels at the end of the driveway by the garage where they were living, was this greenhouse. From the outside, it almost looked perfect. But going inside, Trevor found, and he didn't go within the structure. He had a person with him that gave him permission to do so and had the authority to do that. But inside, you could see that might have been Shanti's place to get away from the chaos in that house and to grow things and do positive things like she had with her business. Investigators grew suspicious of the circumstances of Shanti's death right off the bat. Because a suicide or suspected murder is rare in this Delaney neighborhood, 2 detectives arrived at the home soon after that 911 call. David said he thought Shanti slipped in the tub, remember? But that's where the alarm bells started going off. She wasn't wet. She wasn't wearing her expensive wedding ring either. And one of her diamond earrings, the one on the side of her head that had sustained the most blunt force trauma, had been removed. But she still had on her left earring. There were no signs of forced entry, which would come up later. Shanti had a young son, Jackson, that she shared custody with his biological father that sometimes stayed with her. David said of the day that Shanti died that he'd walked his dog and was staying out of Shanti's way as she worked. It wasn't until later in the afternoon when he called up to Shanti to see if he should pick up Jackson from school that he found Shanti unresponsive in the tub. The two detectives, I don't know how many exclamation points I can convey. Those two detectives that showed up that first day were Teresa Sprague and Barbara Sharp, and they made sure that Shanti would get the justice that she so deserved and the family needed for some sense of peace. But back to Detective Teresa Sprague. With her experience with domestic violence, she knew to call that medical examiner immediately. Shanti's case was preserved and all elements that would lead to real answers thanks to those two detectives. Teresa was able, with the medical examiner's assistance, to see clear signs of strangulation in Shanti's eyes. It's these red dots or hematoma that she'd seen before that indicate strangulation. The medical examiner agreed this wasn't a simple slip and fall in the tub. They asked David to go into the station for a voluntary interview, and he agreed. With him gone, they looked closer at the scene. There was zero water on, in, or around the tub. There was dry, diluted blood on the shower walls and tub, and they were able to obtain latent prints from every surface. Because it was Shanti's day to pick up Jackson, investigators found out when she didn't arrive, the school called his biological father, who came and picked Jackson up. His name was Jim Cooper, and when he found out that Shanti and David didn't show up to pick up Jackson, he was angry, especially when David wouldn't take his phone call. Jim picked up Jackson and drove to their house, saying in a later interview that was the biggest mistake of his life. Jim arrived to see police cars all over the block. Jackson was in the car with him. You can't take those images away from a child. Shanti was autopsied the next day. The cause of death was found to be twofold: blunt force trauma to the head and strangulation. Apparently, she had been hit in the head and incapacitated and then strangled later when she hadn't actually completely died. So she had probably been suffering for hours. They don't know how long. A couple hours, many hours. She had bruising on both sides of her face. One ear had been pulled hard. It was more proof of a violent attack. There was zero water found in her lungs, so much for slipping and drowning in the bathtub. Pressed, David said he was afraid that the house had been broken into that Tuesday by a guy he said looked like the actor Woody Harrelson. Investigators couldn't find Shanti's wedding ring. Oh, and Shanti's phone hadn't pinged since the night before at 11 p.m. Investigators took a deeper look around the house and still couldn't find the wedding ring. Going down the path of the burglary theory, Detective Sprague asked a colleague who works in the area about a homeless man that looks like Woody Harrelson, and he said he knew exactly who David was talking about, adding that this man was skittish around people and might be suffering from schizophrenia or something like that. They found him a few days later on Orange Avenue and they interviewed him. They let him go because they were so convinced he had no involvement in the burglary and in Shanti's death. Investigators said the burglary scenario was baseless. After doing their investigation, there was no forced entry. Cash and electronics were still in the house, cell phones too, credit cards as well. There was no overturned furniture. There was nothing to indicate that Shanti had fought, and there was no unaccounted for DNA. That's when talks with David got serious and turned into an interrogation. They noticed he never once shed a tear, which, okay, people have different emotional responses to trauma, so I need to give him a pass on that. But they started looking at his finances and Shanti's finances, and it started telling a chilling story. But first, the men's club. As investigators spoke with neighbors, they said David was known to frequent men's clubs. Those are male-only bathhouses, and he'd been there 65 plus times in the last few months alone. In fact, he'd been a member for 18 months or more. The main objective at a men's club is having consensual sex with other men. Days before Shanti's murder, David had visited a men's club, and he'd had sex with a couple guys. He seemed to be living a secret life. Months prior to Shanti's death, she told friends that David claimed to be a millionaire, but he never paid for anything, not since they were dating. He also never worked the entire time he knew Shanti. In fact, Shanti was wildly successful. She received a trust from her father that set her business up, and she was wildly successful, paying herself $50,000 a month. Investigators dug into David's finances too and found out he'd never received any sort of inheritance from his father. And he also had hidden accounts with substantial money in them that he hid from Shanti. She died not knowing about them. And there was tension because Shanti was paying for all of these costly renovations on her own. But she wasn't on the deed, remember? So she could never recoup that money if they divorced. In fact, her steadfast to-do list item that was found on her computer day after day after day in all caps said, "Name on house deed." When authorities arrested David on August 29th, they went through his belongings that were at his mother's house where he had been staying, and in his suitcase they found Shanti's wedding ring that they'd been looking for months. That erased all doubt in their minds. It took 5.5 years to get David to trial. The COVID lockdown was a good 2+ year delay. And then there was a mental health crisis that bled on and on. But finally, they got him to court in 2023. It ended up that financial records were their best witness. The money that David took, the life insurance policies he kept trying to access, the accounts he changed into his name, keeping the house in his name as well. The jury found him guilty of murder in the first degree, and he was sentenced to life in 2023. Shanti's son, Jackson, was brave, and he gave a victim's statement to the court before sentencing. This murder is chilling for lots of reasons, and some details that stuck with me long after I did the research were that David wore a bright red tank top when he went in for a police interview. It just feels wildly inappropriate, almost like a subconscious way of saying, "Catch me," wanting to be caught. Also, he'd been having these secret interludes with men at bathhouses, and he ends up staging Shanti's murder as an accident that involved a bathtub. I just don't like that. Also, the way he took pains, and he planned to kill her while her son wasn't around. He was at school, and the dogs were safely in their kennel. 8 weeks before Shanti was killed, she had an emergency appendectomy. That made investigators remember what friends of David's first wife had suspected, that David had poisoned that first wife early in their marriage. Now, I have to make a note that his first wife is steadfast supporting David. She may even be doing his financial accounts right now as he's in jail, keeping track of them and paying bills as they need to be paid. She hasn't said a disparaging word about David, but her friends told investigators that when they were married, David bragged all the time about cooking all the food for his first wife and making all the drinks. And very early on in that marriage, she started having serious gut issues that she still suffers from today. This became a major issue and a theory that they started trying to look at closer when a fellow inmate said David talked to him about a poison that you could get from tree frogs and put in somebody's salsa and kill them. Okay, isn't that creepy and gross? But also, I have to say, not exactly a credible witness, right? A fellow inmate. I told you that Shanti's son Jackson was brave and made a statement to the court before David Tronnes was sentenced. He's the bright spot in this. He really is. The family leaned in and raised Jackson, and he seems like a good young man. That's a credit to Jim. That's a credit to Shanti. That's a credit to their family. He saw what the detectives achieved in giving the family answers, and he's made it his life goal to be a police officer himself, in spite of Detective Teresa Sprague telling him to just go and live a happy life. Jackson said he wants to help people just like him. I looked online, and the house is still sitting there, not for sale, just rotting. Property taxes, if you're curious, for the house in 2024 were $16,071. I don't know why I feel the need to tell this story of Shanti Cooper, except that I want people to remember that violence isn't an answer. Crime touches so many people, and violence is never a credible answer. Never. Ever. David was living this secret other life, and I feel sad that he couldn't live out loud. He felt like he had to, I don't know, have this secret. Maybe that was part of the thrill, is presenting as one way and presenting as another way. I don't know. And if he didn't have the money that he said from any inheritance, I wonder if he was initially drawn to Shanti because she was financially successful. I don't know. I don't think he's ever going to give that depth of answers. But what I do know is this is a time where we're living in that it's hard to have a soul and to feel for the perpetrator and the victim. But I feel like that's what I'm pressed to do. Have empathy for all and not lose my humanity. I hope you're out there in this crazy space we're in right now, finding ways to stay in touch with your humanity and your soul. Just know I'm out here too, and I've got your back. I've got your front. I've got your sides. I've definitely got your ears every now and again, don't I? And I don't take that for granted. Until next week, stay curious. I love you.